All right, well, welcome to today's video. Today I'm not going to be showing you any particular quilt block. I'm going to give you tips and tricks, just little things that you can do to be a better quilter. I know a lot of you are very experienced, some of you may not be. Some of these things you might know, some you might not. So let's go on tips and tricks to make your quilt look a little bit more professional. The first tip is always start a new quilt with a new sewing machine needle. Now you can do a block with whatever needle you've got on there, but if you're doing a whole project all at one go, put a new machine needle in. You don't want any nicks in the needle or bent tips to snag your fabric. I like to use a size 80 for piecing, and I use 100 or 110 if I'm using my machine to quilt it and bind it. Also, always make sure you dispose of sharp things properly. Put your used, broken, or bent pins and needles into an empty pill bottle with a childproof cap. When the bottle is full, tape it securely closed with strong tape and dispose in the trash. Also, change or sharpen your rotary cutter blade when you need to. I know the blades are expensive, but when they start chewing your fabric up instead of giving you a nice clean cut, it's time to either sharpen or change them. Make sure you just do dispose of your used rotary cutter blades properly. Put them back in the plastic box they came in, or a plastic box that another rotary cutter blade came in. Put a big X on it. Fill that box as full as you can. When it's full, tape it up, dispose of it in the trash. Let's talk how to start your seam without getting that rat's nest of thread on the back of your piece. First, and what you'll have to do if you have to manually bring your bobbin thread up, is just hold both tails while you get started. Just bring your bobbin thread up to the top, make sure you get it securely, slide your fabric under, hold that down, start sewing. If your machine has an automatic thread cutter, the instructions that came with your machine will probably say you don't have to bring the top or the bottom thread up to begin your seams, but you probably will end up with a rat's nest. So at the very least, bring up the top thread and hold it tight while you begin sewing. In most cases, that will prevent the rat's nest, because usually the rat's nest is the top thread being pulled down to the bottom. You'll see in this clip, however, that it doesn't always work. If you do get a small rat's nest, just flip it out and try again. The best way to ensure you don't get a rat's nest on the back of your fabric when you start the seam is to chain stitch. Sew one piece, don't cut your threads, sew the next piece. But if you're just starting, you haven't got anything that you just finished, start on a scrap piece of fabric. Run your scrap piece of fabric through. Again, do not cut your threads, let that sit behind, and then start sewing your seam. Now let's talk about what to do to avoid waste when doing what I like to call flip and fold corners, where you've got a square that you've sewn onto the corner of something, and then you're going to cut away in the seam allowance, a 1/4 inch away in the seam allowance, and fold that corner up. What do you do with those leftover triangles? Well, that's easy. You make more half square triangles to use in something else. So the way you do that is before you cut, instead of cutting it, you sew your first seam across the diagonal as directed, and then sew again 1/2 inch away in the seam allowance, and then cut between the two seams. So how do you find that 1/2 inch? Well, the first way would be to actually draw it on. Lay your ruler down, draw a line 1/2 inch away in the seam allowance, and sew on that line. The other way to do it is to use this little device. It's called a seam guide or a quilting guide. It comes with most sewing machines. Most newer sewing machines do have a place on just the regular presser foot holder to slide this in. My old machine, the only way to slide that in was there was a slot in the walking foot to slide it in. So in that case, I had to draw the line. Well, let me show you how to install this and then how to use it. If you look at the bar that holds your pressure foot, you should see a little, probably plastic lined little hole that looks like this. Just go ahead and slide the seam guide into that hole, line it up with the 1/2 inch mark on your base plate, or use the ruler to find the 1/2 inch if you haven't got a good 1/2 inch mark. And then put your fabric under your machine, line up the seam with the edge alignment of the seam guide, and go ahead and sew. Here's the front view of what it looks like to line up the previous seam with your seam guide that is aligned to the 1/2 inch mark, and sew along to create a parallel seam. So no matter which way you found your 1/2 inch mark, now take your piece over to the cutting mat and cut halfway between those two parallel seams. You should have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So now press both your main piece, in this case I was making a flying geese unit, press it open and press open the little 1/2 square you've cut off, and there you go. Let's talk pinning now. Your machine may vary. Some machines may require you to pin a lot, and some you may not need to hardly pin at all. My older machine, the fabric, if I tried to pin it or to not pin and sew a long seam, the two edges would slip apart sideways, and it got so frustrating. My instructor, when I was first learning to quilt, said real quilters don't pin, so I tried to not pin, and I just got so frustrated. I think there were times I was probably in tears. I was so frustrated. I was constantly picking my seams out and putting them back together. Don't let quilt snobs shame you if your machine requires that you pin. If your machine is like my current one and the fabric doesn't slip in it, it's so much nicer. You will only really need to pin where you're trying to make seams meet and points meet and that sort of thing. So to pin to make seams meet, where seams cross, you just need to pin down your seam allowances on either side. So the way you do that is that when your seams cross, first nest the seams. Have the seam allowance of one piece going one way and the other piece going the other way, and then just kind of manipulate until you feel those seams just kiss, is what I call it, and pin each side of the seams, pinning down the seam allowance and ensuring that your fabric is not going to slip under the sewing machine. The next thing you might be wondering is, can you sew over those pins that you have so carefully placed to keep your points meeting? And while a lot of people will tell you no, I'm going to tell you that you can, so long as you sew at a reasonably moderate speed. If you sew at a reasonably moderate speed, closer to the turtle than the hare on my speed diagram, you can sew across your pins. If your needle hits a pin at that speed, it will simply deflect and slide beside the pin. But if you're one of those people who sews out, flat out, pedal to the metal, you will have to remove your pins before you sew over them. Because if you hit a pin at that speed, the pin and or the needle will most likely break or bend or jam or something like that, and could even damage your machine, could have parts flying around. And the downside of taking your pins out before you get to them is, okay, first of all, you have to stop to do that if you're sewing flat out, and secondly, once those pins are out, if there's no stitching there, things can slip. Now let's talk pressing. Always press your seam allowances to one side. This is actually a stronger seam than when you press the seam allowances open. It also doesn't leave any tiny little gaps where all you have is the sewing thread and not the fabric. If you stretch that too tight, you can get these tiny little gaps where fibers of the batting can eventually work their way through. So always press your seam allowances to one side to be a stronger seam and a seam where batting can't come through. Now, which direction do you press your seams? You've probably heard the rule, press things to the dark fabric. And that's all well and good. If the piece you're sewing doesn't have any cross seams or anything like that, press it to the dark side. However, most of the time, it's only the first seam that's not going to have anything crossing it or bumping into it or whatever. So if you have seams crossing or bumping into each other, press the seam allowances the direction they want to go. First off, the fewer layers of fabric, the flatter your seam allowance is going to be. And also, it's really, really hard to press it the direction it doesn't want to go. So here's what you do. If you've got a place where one seam bumps into another to form a T, press what is essentially the upright of the T towards the crossbar. So you're not folding a thickness of seam allowance back over itself. You're pushing it away. That's the direction it wants to go. And it's perfectly okay, though, for especially a long seam allowance to have part of it pressed one way and another part pressed the other way. So if you've got a T coming in from one side over, to the left, and a T coming in from the other side on the right, press the one on the left away from the T. Press the one on the right away from the T. In between those two spots, your seam allowance is going to twist. Just lay your iron on there and press really firmly at the point where it twists. And there you go. Your seam allowances are pressed the direction they really want to go anyways. There's a special case in how to twist your seams when you have crossing seams that actually meet, where you've done the pinning on either side so your points meet up perfectly. You're going to actually twist your seams. So you're going to take the seam on one side and put all the layers and push it one way, and the seam on the other side and all the layers and push it the other way. To do this, you may have to unpick do not clip the threads of the first seams that you crossed. You just want to unpick them. You'll still want them to remain held down by the crossing seam, but that way you have this nice little twist on the back of, like, where a 4-patch meets in the middle or something like that. And if you're really careful, you can even do this with seams that are not straight across from one another, like for whatever reason you have two flying geese that are meeting point to point, or you have a flying geese meeting a square and a square, something like that. It's a little more fiddly, but it's doable. You actually will need to, in the little seam allowance, there'll be little points sticking out that you actually will have to twist past the fabric on the other side, but it's doable. All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed learning a few little tips and tricks that'll help you have your points meet better, have flatter seam allowances, and just overall have your quilts come out looking a little more professional. I hope this has helped. If you like this content, please do subscribe and watch for future videos. Thanks for watching.